Okay, y'all, let's begin. Go ahead and stop share, Bruce, and everyone else, if you can and you're willing, please join Bruce and I via video. This first hour will be mostly information sharing, and then the second hour, as I transition to Bruce, there will be a practice share that we will invite you all to join. Welcome, welcome. What's up, Lindsay? How are you all?
Doing good, doing okay. How are you doing?
I'm here. I'm good. Okay, Rachel, Wendy, Jamie, KT, Robin, thank you for joining us. My name is Sean Leonardo. I'm the co-director over at Recess in Brooklyn. Today's session will build upon the workshop that Pastor Isaac Scott from the Confined Arts and I conducted quite a few months ago that really looked deeply at the principles of a trauma-informed practice, and even more specifically, try to hone in on the ways in which those principles might manifest themselves in the beginning, middle, and end of a workshop with system-impacted individuals. And even more precisely, we look deeply at the ways in which our work, our curriculums, our exercises might function in prison settings. Today's workshop will actually take a step backward, or maybe a step more deeply into how these principles of a trauma-informed practice are influenced by our understanding, clinically and otherwise, of what trauma is. And we will try to locate those understandings and learnings to what we will describe as a somatic practice in particular. And in a somatic philosophy, we look at the ways in which this work engages trauma as it is housed within our bodies. And we will look a little bit at how there is a clinical correlation to that philosophy, to how we understand the impact of trauma on our nervous systems in particular. And I'll start to describe that more fully as we move into the workshop, but just to clarify that a bit further, when we say that we are attempting to engage, one moment, someone else is coming in, when we're attempting to engage how trauma manifests itself through the body and therefore in physical space with our participants, specifically system-impacted participants, and even more specifically, those who have been impacted by the carceral systems. What we are trying to articulate are the ways in which trauma associated with oppression might have a hold on the way a person might be present in space with us. And therefore, in order to lead towards something that might resemble healing, we may have to start with the body and psyche, the mind-body connection. And so that is how we will begin to describe the somatic as central to this practice in our understandings of how trauma really impacts, hi Helen, this is all going to be very familiar to Helen, the way in which trauma impacts quite literally how someone shows up in space. Okay. Welcome. For those of you that just joined a little bit later, a very quick recap in that this particular workshop will build upon a workshop Pastor Isaac Scott from the Confined Arts and I led a few months ago, which looked at the principles of a trauma-informed practice. And today we'll be moving more deeply into understandings of what we mean by trauma and how that is housed in the practice, housed in the body, excuse me. And therefore, the ways in which, with that understanding, we might move into the principles of not only a trauma-informed artistic practice, but even more specifically, a somatic practice, the ways in which trauma might be engaged through bodily somatic practices. So we'll just start. I'm going to share my screen. And again, for the next 40 minutes, we'll really take a deeper dive into these understandings and then a clinical correlation into what trauma might look like through the nervous system. And then we'll transition into a collective practice that Bruce from the Phoenix Players will lead. Okay. One moment. So this first video that I will share. One second. Is everyone seeing my screen? Okay, beautiful. It's from Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. And what we want to start to describe is what is trauma, so that we have a holistic understanding of what we are attempting to engage in our participants, and specifically system-impacted participants. And even more critically, what is the difference between trauma and stress? I may not play the full 7.5 minutes, but we'll see how this goes.
The most important thing to know is that there's a difference between trauma and stress. As I like to say to people, life sucks a good amount of the time. We all have jobs and situations that are really unpleasant. But the moment that situation is over, it's over. The problem with trauma is that when it's over, your body continues to relive it. My name is Bessel van der Kolk. I'm a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and author of the book, The Body Keeps the Score. I got interested in trauma on my first day working at the Veterans Administration. 1978 was the year, and the Vietnam War was over by about 6 or 7 years. The very first day that I met Vietnam veterans, I was just blown away. These were guys who were my age, who were clearly smart and competent and athletic, and they clearly were just a shadow of their former self. Their bodies were clearly affected by trauma, and they had a very hard time connecting with new people after the war. Around that time, a group of us started to define what trauma is, and in the definition of PTSD, we write, these people have been exposed to an extraordinary event that's outside of normal human experience. In retrospect, that shows us how ignorant and narrow-minded we were, because it turned out that this is not an unusual experience at all. People usually think about the military when they talk about trauma, but at least 1 out of 8 kids in America witness physical violence between their parents. A larger number of kids get beaten very hard by their own caregivers. A very large number of people in general, but women in particular, have sexual experiences that were clearly unwanted and that left them confused and enraged. So, unlike what we first thought, trauma is actually extremely common. There's a lot of debate of what a trauma is to this day. But basically, trauma is something that happens to you that makes you so upset that it overwhelms you. There is nothing you can do to stave off the inevitable. You basically collapse in a state of confusion, maybe rage, because you are unable to function in the face of this particular threat. But the trauma is not the event that happens, the trauma is how you respond to it. One of the largest mitigating factors against getting traumatized is who is there for you at that particular time. When, as a kid, you get bitten by a dog, it's really very scary and very nasty. But if your parents pick you up and say, "Oh, I see that you're really in bad shape, let me help you," that dog bite doesn't become a big issue because the foundation of your safety has not been destroyed. We are profoundly interdependent people, And as long as our relationships are intact, by and large, we're pretty good with trauma. It's a subjective experience, and what may be traumatic for you may not be traumatic for me, depending on our personality and our prior experiences. The problem with trauma is that it starts off with something that happens to us, but that's not where it stops, because it changes your brain. Much of the imprint of trauma is in that very primitive survival part of your brain that I like to call the cockroach brain. There's a part of you that just picks up what's dangerous and what's safe. And when you're traumatized, that little part of your brain, which is usually very quiet, continues to just send messages. I'm in danger. I'm not safe. That event itself is over, but you continue to react to it.
Okay. So this, we start to build a foundation as to how we're really understanding what is manifesting itself in a space, potentially with system impacted participants. Now there's a passage here that has really influenced my understanding and provides the kind of filter in which I look at a trauma-informed practice. And it states the normal trajectory of a trauma that resolves, that you go through it, you may repeat it over and over in your head, but then that aspect fades after time, and then ultimately it gets metabolized into your system. And sleep has a lot to do with this, creating cohesive narratives around an event that can be understood, metabolized, and moved on. But if it doesn't, it gets trapped in your nervous system and you're reacting to it all the time. That reaction can manifest in many different ways. And we spoke a little bit about in the last workshop, how to create the conditions of this foundational safety so that the nervous system is lowered in a particular space. And bringing our attention to everything from the ways in which someone joins us, the type of language we use, the physical setting, the lighting, the tools, the ways in which folks can opt in and opt out of an exercise, and also how we close out. What are the ways in which they are brought into a caring scenario so that their nervous systems are not activated? This is what we begin to mean by how do we become more and more attuned to the ways in which trauma might be housed and in the body, and therefore, how is that informing our practices? Now, as we move to Bruce's exercise later on in the day, we wanted to make a distinction between a somatic practice that is trauma-informed that might lead to something like positive relief or release, versus a somatic practice that actually engages trauma through a filter of system impact. Now, in Western philosophy, and I borrow this definition from an organization named Generative Somatics. And I should say that the previous workshop and all the links that I am screening today, along with some of the foundational information for Bruce's exercise, will all be distributed after this workshop. Through the philosophy that generative somatics provides, we actually take a critical eye to the way in which, in many cases, Western philosophies have carved out somatics in a suggestion that, and through breathing practices, yoga, some movement-based contemplative practices, that we're actually engaging with trauma, but at the same time, beginning to create space for a relief or a release. And while that is all true and necessary, through a political analysis, there's also the understanding that a somatic practice can engage specifically with the way in which oppression and power has imposed itself on our bodies and psyches. So it directly hones in on an experience with, say, arrest or imprisonment to understand how the body has reshaped itself under that oppression. So there's a different type of intentional engagement with the soma, with the mind, body, spirit connection. But before we get there and before we exemplify this in Bruce's practice, we now created a distinction between stress and trauma. Let's take a little bit of a deeper dive as to the ways in which trauma may actually manifest itself through the body. I'm sorry, are you all hearing the video? Could someone give me a, yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, forgive that awful background music within that video. But what I do enjoy about the trajectory of that video is that it gets highly specific as to the manifestations of those four conditions that we often, particularly I find, with a public or audience or constituency that we might describe as system impacted, we often only look for a fight response through a level of aggression. And we often don't build an attunement for the other three modalities or even more specificity as to what fight might look like. I really also think quite a bit in terms of the flight responses, how overproduction, how staying busy could be a response to trauma. And then the fawn response system is something that is sort of being newly articulated in the field, particularly amongst younger participants who may choose to just constantly please an instructor, or who may look at an educator or mentor as a parent figure and will do everything within their power to not lose that connection, a dependency that's developed on that figure. And so the specificity as to how how this trauma might manifest itself, not only through behavior, but really through physical manifestations. And again, the correlation with how that is stored within the nervous system is critical to how we conduct our spaces. And I just wanted to be a bit more specific as to what we mean by the ways in which our nervous systems are not regulated. By trauma response in any one of these departments, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, what we are also saying is that the reaction can be sudden, unexpected, but also prolonged. And that has a direct correlation with the way that it has not been metabolized through the nervous system. So it is reactive for a longer period of time because, as the video stated, the threat feels real and current. So its connection to a past event is in the present. So for a moment, I'd love to open up the space and for folks to, if willing, to share the ways in which they have seen a trauma response manifest itself in their educational spaces with any of their participants. And if you could, withholding and protecting your participants, really try to describe in detail what might have been the sensory cause, and then what did it look like, sound like, feel like in the space. And feel free to drop it in the chat or just unmute yourself.
I can start one to get us
Thanks,
going.
Jamie.
Apologies, I just got out of the shower. I was getting dressed as this workshop started. So this is not actually something that happened in a carceral space, but because of my work in carceral spaces, I was more aware that what I was witnessing was a trauma response. It was actually with a fellow faculty member at the college that I work with. So I was working on a play, a show. I do theater. I work with Bruce and Phoenix Players Theater Group. And we had like a cast list, a production list with phone numbers and emails. And one of the faculty members had volunteered to be a choreographer. And she got a text from the rest of the production crew about some update. And she realized that there was a student on this text list, and she called me and she was like, oh my gosh, students can't have my phone number. I'm gonna have to change my number. And like, it was just very a very heightened response. And she was spinning out basically. And so I sort of realized like, okay, it feels like this is probably a trauma response because it's so heightened to what the situation was. And it turns out through talking with her that a student had stalked her previously. So she was really wary of any students having her number. So it was just something like, once I realized it, I could just kind of let her talk it out and put things in perspective without being like, you're acting crazy, you know, because that doesn't work. But that's a little example.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, and thank you for really taking us through that narrative. Anyone else? Jamie's reflection is reminding me of an instance, and for clarification purposes, for context, Recess, we work specifically with system impacted young people age 18 to 26. So this is in regards to young folks that will have an open charge, both in misdemeanor and felony charges. And this particular individual, I can remember very clearly, was withdrawing from the activity. And we happened to have a guest speaker, practitioner. And at some point, I was sort of navigating the space quietly. And so no one really thought much of it, though, you know, with the permission of being able to opt out, we felt comfortable with the ways in which this person was withdrawn, at least momentarily. And then the person returned to the space, and it became clear that they were looking for some object. And I can't recall what it was. I think it was something as simple as a lighter, a match lighter. And asked one of our peer, and in other words, young leaders in the space, if they had seen this object. And because we were amidst the program itself, in the middle of the activity, I think the young person said something to the effect of, I haven't seen it, but we can all look for it later. That was enough to feel dismissive to the participant, who then activated physically and confrontationally in the space. Something as simple as, we will look for it later. Now, it would come to light that this person was struggling with houselessness. And so the idea, or the feeling, the experience of not having that lighter actually struck a much deeper chord, and the traumatic experience of abandonment and not having something to call home. And I want to come back to the ways in which that was resolved, both temporarily and longer term, but I'll withhold for now, in case anyone else wants to share an experience or reflection.
I just want to say, like, I'm really trying to think, because it feels like there's an infinite number after watching that video. And I'm thinking of, like, literally every student I have in my class right now. And almost, and so many interactions I've had. But also I'm thinking about, I was thinking about myself during that video and just being like, yep, I'm fight and flight every time. And have I done, and I've probably even done that to my students also, you know, so like both ways. I think I've also probably responded in a way that I wish I hadn't towards them. But
no,
yeah,
thank you, Robin. Thank you for that honesty. I think, you know, as human beings, we have to recognize that with trauma response, we can also become activated. And quite often in the dynamic with any of our participants, regardless of age, there is the risk that how trauma manifests itself in a participant will actually rub up against our own traumas. And therefore there becomes a almost uncontrollable exchange in which both nervous systems are escalating. I think we most tangibly, incredibly look at that in our personal relationships, in our familial relationships. But there are ways, and I think it's sincere to say, Robin, that in our participants, we can be activated by what we are experiencing in the space. Mm-hmm. And I'll get to this a bit further in a moment, but the limitations of that last video is that it places all the onus of regulation on the individual experiencing an activation. You will also find that I don't particularly, in my own practice, use the terminology of triggering. And while it's semantics, the reason that I often do not is because in its symbolism or in its visualization, it seems as a one-time thing, and that there's an escalation that is like a bullet, linear. And in my experience, that's not how it functions. Oftentimes, in terms of sensory overwhelm, it can be a much slower build. And the ways in which that starts to spill out of someone's body in terms of an activated nervous system can actually look like many things at once. So someone could be aggressively verbal and withdrawing physically. Someone could attempt to occupy themselves, but also try to please someone. And so I really try to hold some complexity as to what might be emerging in the space, you know? And in my experience, the sensory cause is quite diverse. I've seen everything from a physical gesture be the starting point, be the cause, a particular word, a particular type of movement in the space, a particular type of physical setting, a type of person in the space activate another individual, without any previous relationship to that individual. I've seen everything as evidenced as a sound versus some type of perceived threat in the way that the activity was moving. And I think it's also important, you know, we think about our responsibility to that activation. And while we can build an attunement to what it might look like, and therefore prepare ourselves in our work to set the conditions of safety, we can never fully know what safety looks and feels like to another human being. And in the previous workshop, what we attempted to convey is in the principles of a somatic-based trauma-informed practice is really what you're centering is in empathy, and therefore creating the conditions for an individual or a group to tell you what it is that they need to feel safe. That in those conditions, the ways in which you are creating, authoring, conducting, closing an exercise, it's not by pre-design, it's by being in relationship with your people. And I think that's a good segue into a shared responsibility to the regulation of our nervous systems. So the other ways in which we create the conditions for relationship to steer our work is with a deeper understanding of a shared responsibility to what is called co-regulation. How do you actually create the conditions of care so that the nervous systems can stay lowered, right? I'm going to share another video.
You know that feeling when your alarm goes off on Friday morning at 5 a.m. Oh, to turn it off and go back to sleep. But today you have an important early meeting. So you take a deep breath, focus on the goal of completing that project you really care about, and you drag yourself out of bed. This is an example of what scientists call self-regulation. It's the act of managing our thoughts and feelings so we behave in ways that help us reach our goals. Self-regulation keeps you from saying something hurtful out loud to a coworker, like, "That's a really bad idea." When you disagree with someone, self-regulation looks like choosing to communicate calmly and respectfully, because it's more important to you to take good care of that relationship than it is to win an argument. We need self-regulation to stay healthy and to succeed in school or at work, in relationships, and in life as a whole. It's a skill worth focusing on. Some think that self-regulation is something you're born being good at, or not. But this is a myth. Anyone can build self-regulation skills over time, like a muscle. And as we build those muscles, we get better at important things, like managing strong emotions in healthy ways, staying on a task even when it's hard, and considering the perspectives of others so that our relationships can thrive. Research shows that adolescence is a critical window of opportunity for building self-regulation muscles, because just like in early childhood, the brain is growing and building connections based on youth's experiences. This growth really impacts those areas of the brain that support self-regulation. One thing to know is the term self-regulation is misleading, because we don't develop it by ourselves. Its development has much more to do with the people in a person's life and what's going on around them. When a person has nurturing and accepting relationships in supportive environments, self-regulation skills can grow, whereas harsh or inconsistent relationships and stressful or chaotic environments short-circuit the development of self-regulation. Knowing that, just think of how important your influence can be on an adolescent's life. You have a powerful opportunity to help youth build their self-regulation skills by providing support through something called co-regulation. Co-regulation means having intentional interactions with young people that foster the skills they need to build healthy and happy lives. To co-regulate means to be caring, responsive, and accepting. Create nurturing, safe spaces to practice and learn. Teach and coach skills that build self-regulation muscles, all while practicing your own self-regulation. Co-regulation happens when we intentionally synchronize these actions as we manage our own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So often, adults take a step back from youth as they hit adolescence, when what youth really need during this time is the opposite. There are many ways to grow your skills as a co-regulator. We'll offer 3. First, practice improving your own self-regulation. It's good for you, and it's important to model when working with youth. Second, build warm relationships and nurturing environments. Imagine yourself as a young person in your program. Do you feel cared for, accepted, and known by the staff? Does the environment feel supportive to you as an individual? Third, coach self-regulation skills. Help youth reframe mistakes as opportunities to try something new and to build their self-regulation muscles. When youth practice their skills, they improve those skills and feel better about themselves. These things may be part of your practice already, but now you have a name, co-regulation, for the kind of support you want to provide. And there's always more to learn. As an adult working with adolescents, you matter. Don't underestimate the impact you can have on their lives. From how you greet each young person in the morning, to the coaching conversations you have, to how you react in front of youth when things don't go exactly the way you planned. Using a co-regulation approach can support a young person in ways that matter to them now and in their future. Fostering a co-regulation mindset is an investment worth making for all of us.
Okay, now this video, as you see, had a particular focus on young people. But I want to make clear that these types of practices I've experienced really functioning with all age ranges and all populations, regardless of the trauma source. Now, for young people, I want to extend what we just saw by sharing that I find that it's incredibly important to utilize this skill set, not only in moments of crisis. We often think about regulation or somatic practices during activation, but a caring environment and the ways in which we regulate our nervous systems, co-regulate our nervous systems, needs to occur at every stage, when things are calm and when things are animated. It is creating the conditions for a person to understand that they're in a safe environment, even when their nervous system is lowered. Now, there are growing studies that show the ways in which, if I am breathing in a regulated state, how somatically that actually communicates to a person in close proximity. And there almost becomes this biological mirroring that happens. So you might know this in reverse in your own interpersonal relationships. Someone starts to get animated, you match that in tone and intensity, and then it becomes this, right? What we're now beginning to understand is that it works in reverse as well, particularly in our breathing and in our behaviors, that if you step it down, the regulation actually starts to impact an individual's nervous system. Now, referring back to the beginning, the very first video, there was a portion in which it started to get into the clinical understanding of how, quite literally, the makeup of our brains is impacted, especially by persistent and what is now known as complex PTSD, which is not only a singular event, but potentially a repetitive event, and or something that is experienced environmental that might feel indirect. So rather than an interpersonal aggression, let's say, maybe it is someone that is in an environment that is plagued by gun violence. And so the sound of bullets going off is part of their experience. Or maybe it is crossing the threshold of a metal detector at school. Or maybe it is the understanding or experience of climate disaster. So that persistent and environmental stressor becomes something that begins to exist in our body as trauma, and we now know has a clinical shift in our brain. And there are growing studies, particularly in young people and adolescents, that show in a caring environment, the brain begins to repair that. It actually starts to restore some of that chemical makeup. So in the few minutes that we have before we transition to Bruce and really start to get you involved in one of these practices, I just wanted to open up the floor for any observations, reflections, ways in which you have seen either trauma response or the ways in which you've tried to mitigate trauma response in your own work. Let's really just open up for a few minutes of conversation. Anything and everything, no wrong answers or questions.
I'll speak again. I think when you were talking, Sean, this idea of a trauma response, I think one that I didn't realize as much when I was involved in PPTG, something that would happen often is if one of the participants business basically came out. People are talking about each other's business, and there would definitely be a heightened response to this idea of like, oh, somebody told somebody, you know, now we all know that this person is dating somebody or something. And then seeing that person get upset, but also withdraw from the group during that session. And I think that upon listening and reflecting, you know, this idea that there is no privacy in prison spaces. And so whatever little bit of privacy they have in terms of information was really important. And so that's something that I think we witnessed a lot.
Thank you for that, Jamie. That's a really great example. Anyone else? Any observations?
I'll talk again, but then I won't talk again after this. But I recently finished my dissertation, and I have a chapter on Rodessa Jones, who works with incarcerated women. And so this subject really interests me. And I was talking to Bruce, who's on my committee, about this idea of being in spaces where there is a lot of trauma. And I think, Bruce, I don't remember the question you asked me, but it was something like, oh, well, how do you identify that somebody has been traumatized or something to that effect? And basically my response was like, well, I just go into a space assuming everybody's been traumatized. And I do that in my classroom as well. And I think that to me really, when I shifted that perspective, because I've been traumatized, you know, I think living in this world, we all encounter some sort of trauma, really is useful instead of waiting until somebody says, you know, shows their trauma, just assuming that everyone has something going on.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think what that reminds me of is, particularly amongst adolescents, what the last few years under the context or with the experience of the pandemic, what that has done, even with indirect knowledge, how fraught that has been, how even in a nurturing home, how that information has seeped into young people's and older's nervous system. And then if you compound that with the visibility of police violence, social unrest, climate disaster, again, even within a nurturing environment, because of increased access to and visibility of crises, many of our young people are experiencing indirect or secondhand trauma response because of the possibility of danger. And I think that we're only really beginning to see how that is manifesting itself in many of our spaces and classrooms. Anyone else?
It's kind of a vague thing, but in a like manifestation, I guess, that keeps coming up in things that are almost formed examples is like embarrassment is something that a lot of participants, I think, is kind of like their biggest sort of fear in class that I've identified is not wanting that. And we're not a theater, we're a visual arts program, so we don't often, you know, have moments where people are, you know, made to be on the spot as part of
on display, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's not part of our program. But that's when I've really noticed that people kind of truly, like in this meeting right now, when I've been thinking of examples, it's typically when people, I think the emotion or like the response I'm identifying is that they've felt embarrassment or that they are being watched by their by their peers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. So Bruce, I'm going to bring you in, and I apologize. I have to move on to another commitment, but I want to leave you with a very critical, important, But very quick point that was made in the last video in terms of how we, in shared responsibility, in the skill of co-regulation, really build a relationship, but also become an empathetic figure in our participants' lives. It passed very quickly, but there was one point in which it was stated that the core of any of these practices is actually being in a state of self-regulation and developing a practice of attunement, developing the skills of a somatic trauma-informed practice requires that we do the work on ourselves first. And I can't tell you, in however many years I've been now doing this work and expanding my practice with this understanding, how many times I have failed in this particular area. Feeling that I had enough resilience, enough armor, enough distance from my own emotional upheaval to conduct a classroom. But that is permeable. And the ways in which we bring our own traumas into a space is also the thing that might activate others. And so I really want to encourage you all to think about how we might build a practice for ourselves first and foremost. Thank you all. Bruce, all yours.
Thanks, Sean. That was a great first hour. Thank you very much. So I'm Bruce Levitt. I've been a facilitator with the Phoenix Players for 14 years. It's a group that was founded by incarcerated men at Auburn Correctional Facility. And this morning, we're going to look at just one of the practices that the group employs over a 2-year process. So this is really only a moment of a full workshop cycle, which then repeats itself every 2 years. And the men who've been in the workshop and are still at Auburn repeat that cycle and help train the next group of men. And Jamie, feel free to help me if you have any comments. I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go through this practice, and then I'm going to ask you to try a few things while you're either seated or if you'd like to stand, to sort of experience just a taste of it, because it's quite, it's an on your feet kind of activity, which is challenging to do over Zoom, but we will try that. So I'm sharing my screen. This is called characterology. It comes out of bioenergetics. The principal contemporary theorist and practitioner of bioenergetics, Alexander Lowen, whose text, Bioenergetics, has a very intense focus on bioenergetics. As Sean pointed out, there are things that happen in trauma that end up being manifested in the brain, but in the nervous system and also in the body. So this really is a somatic practice. I'll explain in a bit how we got to bioenergetics, but I'd like to introduce a little bit about the Phoenix Players to better contextualize how this is used. I'd like to, first of all, cite my friend Kurt Tofflin, who many of you know, who founded Shakespeare Behind Bars. And this is something that we as practitioners are constantly aware of, that we are artists who do artistic work that can be therapeutic, but we're not therapists who do mental health work that is artistic, and that we try not to forget the difference, because the problem is we leave the building, we leave the prison every Friday night after the workshop, and the men stay there. And so we don't want to leave them in a state of trauma, tension, or where something comes up that they can't process by themselves. And the mental health resources in the facility are like the rest of the resources in the facility. They're not the best. So why theater? And this again is from Kurt's sort of ramblings about theater, that it closely resembles real life in real time, that it's traveling a world of for real, where I can seek via the authenticity of my outer world being a reflection of my inner world. Making theater in a prison, I'll skip down a little bit, is a release from the structure and stricture of a punitive world where everyday life is about the binary of permission and denial. Creating theater is an act of duality born of humility and hubris. It can be both sacred and silly, profound and profane, selfless and selfish, a form of getting and giving, anchoring and transporting. It socializes, it releases a person's humanity. So let me get to the next slide. Why am I not? Okay. I don't know why I'm not going forward. Let me stop my share and go back and see what's going on here. Okay. Share screen. Boom. Share. Okay. For some reason, my slides aren't advancing. Let's see if I can do it a different way here. Anybody have any suggestions? Let's see, share screen. Boom. I'll start from the beginning and see what happens here. Share, okay. Okay, here we go. So going back to Bessel van der Kolk, traumatized people are terrified to feel deeply. They are afraid to experience their emotions because emotions lead to loss of control. In contrast, theater is about embodying emotions, giving voice to them, becoming rhythmically engaged, taking on and embodying difference. So this is the landing page for the Phoenix Players Theater Group on the website. And this is the motto. We are a community of transformation. Through the power of self-discovery, we create the opportunity to know and grow into ourselves. The motto was written by one of the founding members, and it incorporates quite succinctly the philosophy of the group, that they are looking for a community in which transformation can occur through the power of discovering themselves, and we, meaning them, agency. The men in the group have agency over the group. We create the opportunity to know and grow into ourselves, clearly implying that they are not themselves in prison. This is from the original PPT brochure. The Phoenix Players Theater Group is a program developed by and for incarcerated persons and communities in a maximum security prison. It is a transformative theater community which utilizes theater to reconnect incarcerated people to their full humanity. Experiences gained through PPTG significantly increase incarcerated people's chances of transcending the negative labels and histories of criminality that define them within the greater society. This was written by Michael Rhines, who's one of the two original founders, and what he had in mind, which we'll follow up with in a minute. For the founders, rehabilitation is about other people having control over your life, while transformation is about taking control of your own life. So this is from Michael Rhines, and why he founded PPTG. And all of this feeds into why we begin early in the practice the use of characterology. One of the reasons I created PPTG is because we're not allowed to have any input into our own transformation. I, for one, do not subscribe to what I call the heart of darkness approach, the theory he extrapolated from reading Joseph Conrad's book. His theory simply means that he doesn't believe people from the outside of any situation should come in to solve problems without conferring with the people who are affected by what's going on in that particular situation. PPTG is rooted in the authenticity of our lives. The thing that sets us apart is that we generate the vast majority of our material from our life experiences. We have complete autonomy over our scripts. And then Michael continues that if one digs deep, one will discover the underlying reasons for most youth crime is some form of pain. In order for PPTG members to transcend past mistakes, they have to confront their pain. My transformation came by way of dealing with the real reasons I was in the streets through the drama of remembering my deeply buried joy and pain. Once my joy and pain was uncovered by PPTG's techniques, I began to write about the missing parts of my life. And then this second co-founder, Sky Williamson, wrote this after he came home from prison. What I carry in general is a deep respect and gratitude in my heart for each founding member's willingness to be a part of and sincerely contribute to the communion of vulnerable and suffering human beings. We looked each other in the eyes each session, and each time chose again to proceed with the very deep emotional work that we had consciously and unconsciously envisioned and assembled ourselves to partake in. Yes, we tapped into our trauma indirectly from a safe enough distance. That's a very important idea, and one of the reasons why characterology is one of the foundational processes that is employed in the workshop. From a safe distance, to recognize the source of the emotions we were each experiencing personally. Consequently, the theatrical work we were doing, as Michael and I had hoped, was also cathartic. For me, this is what PPTG is about, getting in touch with our inner life and its kindling sources so that we, incarcerated people, can gain an absolute awareness and management of our individual lives for the present and the future. PPTG became the avenue of actual practice by which I and other people seeking healing and greater understanding of themselves could explore and learn about ourselves and human nature, again, without directly opening old wounds. That's another important issue, which require professional intervention to address. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and see if there are any questions up to this point about the context of PPTG's practice and founding. Any questions or comments or responses? Jamie, anything to add? It's kind of a quick précis, I know, but
no, nothing to add.
Okay, thanks. No questions. Okay, so I'll go back to sharing my screen. And this is an introduction to characterology. And we began to use it because my colleague, Steve Cole, who was the original facilitator and who invited me to come and join him about 4 months after the group was founded, had begun to use characterology as an acting technique because it's a very quick and physical way to create character. It's important to know how energy is held in the body. So the basis of characterology is that traumas experienced repeatedly over time form physical expressions of holding and take over the burden of trauma so that we don't have to deal with it consciously. And notice Sean mentioned fight, freeze. Well, the word frozen is here, right? The physical holdings, frozen traumas expressed in the musculature of the body can be seen as lenses through which we see the world. They filter experience to distill life so we can digest only what we perceive as acceptable. Defenses that are held in the body almost always have lives of their own. They don't want to be exposed. Another way we can see defenses is as a buffer between inner and outer worlds, as a framework with which to organize the material through which to explore these defenses that are habitually used to some extent. These slides outline the 5 basic character structures used in the study of bioenergetics. It's important to note here that character structure does not help a person define who they or others are. It describes the way people distort who they are. Character defenses were built from the time an individual was very young. They have been useful to us in defending ourselves in situations that we could find no other way to handle when we were young. A character structure defense is the result of feeling unsafe. I think I'm going to stop sharing here for a second and see if we need to review any of that. The basic tenet behind characterology is that all of these traumas begin to build over time, beginning in childhood, and they are either repeated or various other kinds of trauma. A person is exposed to various other kinds of trauma. And the basic tendency that began when one was young becomes reinforced over time. And so that they physically manifest themselves in the body. The notion behind characterology is that energy flows through the body. And what happens when you have a physical defense structure, you block energy from flowing to parts of your body. And Lowen's take on this is that this even affects the way, when it begins in childhood, the way the body develops in terms of the look of the body, the musculature of the body, the height of the body, the way we gesture with our arms, the way we use our bodies, even our vocal pitches can be influenced by the trauma that we have while we're young. Now, again, let me reiterate, by practicing the physicality of characterology, this is introduced to the men and by the men when they begin to train the next generation, begin to invite the next generation of PPTG members into the group. It's a way of creating a space between the trauma and the practice of characterology, because we're introducing it as a theater technique. We're introducing it as a way to create characters and to perform characterization. Let me go back here. Okay. So characterology seeks to explain the way childhood trauma manifests itself in adult behavior, body shape, health, happiness, and spiritual well-being. Patterns that show up in your life are the result of your character structure defense playing itself out over and over, getting the same results until you one day wake up and ask why on earth this is happening again. Dr. Alexander Lowen, who studied with Wilhelm Reich, evolved them from the standard terms. Each type has a special pattern of defense on both the psychological and muscular levels, physiological and muscular levels, that distinguishes it from other types. Again, this is not a classification of people, but of defensive positions. It is recognized that no individual is a pure type and that every person in our culture combines in different degrees within his, her personality, their personality, some or all of these defense patterns. Nevertheless, it is necessary to speak in terms of types for the sake of clarity. And again, Lowen gave these sort of traditional psychological terms, and other people in intervening years have given them different labels. So Lowen's label is the schizoid. Others since Lowen have called it the unwanted child or the creator. And the drawing on the right of my screen gives an example of how the schizoid, or the unwanted child or creator, presents physically. And we'll get into that in a moment. So why did Lowen describe this particular characterology as schizoid, and why do other people describe it as the unwanted child or creator? And you'll notice as we go through this that characterologies not only produce defense systems that sometimes are negative for us in our behaviors and our interactions with other people, but they also have created highly positive characteristics as well. Lowen named this structure schizoid because of its characteristic split between the mind and the body. People with this structure are highly creative and intelligent and have rich fantasy lives. Their issues center around the right to exist. Often extremely intelligent, artistic, creative, highly spiritual, and often psychic. They are also unable to connect with others instead of living in their fantasy world. Instead, they live in their fantasy world to escape reality. They often have trouble with money or making things happen, and the world can seem terrifying. Schizoids suffer from self-disapproval, that something is wrong with them. They are overly sensitive to criticism and rejection from others because at some level they don't approve of themselves. Fear of being on earth includes fear of being in the body. Schizoids experience their bodies as constricted, messy, and unreliable. Because there's a disassociation from reality, the body, and feeling, the schizoid has a huge fantasy life. For these people, using abstract intelligence is the only way, because feeling isn't involved. So what happens is that in the schizoid, that basically begins with some rejection in childhood, usually by a parent or a caregiver or someone close to the child. And because of that rejection, the person then begins to feel inauthentic and feels that they can't connect with people. And then when that happens over and over again, as they grow and develop, the physicalization in the body begins to manifest itself in a physical structure. So this is the physical structure that Lowen describes of the unwanted child, the creative, or the schizoid. The face is blank and mask-like. The head may tilt to one side. The eyes are not alive and do not make contact. They are vacant. They're an absence of feeling in the eyes. If a schizoid looks at you, you immediately sense a lack of contact. The main tension areas are at the base of the skull, shoulder joints, leg joints, and abut the diaphragm. There is a marked discrepancy between the top half and bottom half of the body. They often look like they don't belong to the same person. Arms hang like appendages rather than an extension of the body. Sometimes they have raised shoulders. The weight of the body is often carried on the outside of the feet, or they walk on the tips of their toes. There can be a restriction in the throat, which leads to a higher pitched voice. So I'm going to stop sharing here and invite you, just where you're seated, to try out some of the physical characteristics of the schizoid and see how that affects you. And I'll try to go back to the schizoid and read it for you. The face of the schizoid is blank. And so the schizoid tilts to one side. see if you can just, if you're willing to try this, please do at your chair. The eyes are not alive and do not make contact. They are vacant. There's an absence of feeling in the eyes. The main tension is at the base of the skull, shoulder joints, leg joints. There's a marked discrepancy between the top half and bottom half. Arms hang like appendages rather than an extension of the body. And they often look like they don't belong to the same person. Anyone want to describe how they're feeling through trying this? Yeah, the tilt of the head, one side. The eyes are vacant. They look like they're not looking at you. The arms are loose. There's tension in the shoulder. They may be raised. Since you're standing, you can't walk on the balls of your feet, but you can begin to. Anybody have a response to how that feels just tasting it here for a second? You start to become a little bit different from yourself. You start to get out of yourself and embody the schizoid. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Okay. Okay, let me go forward here and get back to where we were. I don't know why this is being. Okay. The next characterology is Lowen labeled the oral. Other people have labeled it the abandoned child, but their strengths are as communicators. And notice the shape of the drawing on the screen. The body, the pelvis is tilted forward and the buttocks is sort of like tucked under. The sternum actually slumps in. The oral structure results from deprivation in the nurturing or nourishment stage of dependency. Oral characters have not had the experience of being completely fulfilled, and they fear they will never get enough. People with this structure are very loving and giving and have empathy with victims of injustice. Experiencing abandonment, the oral character, so as opposed to being rejected by someone in childhood that was important to the child in childhood it feels abandoned by someone, probably a parent or a caregiver who was important to them. The oral character grows up feeling deprived. Their feelings of emptiness make them dependent and manipulative in an effort to get their needs met. Sometimes they're geniuses, very loving and giving, very compassionate and empathetic. Also, they can feel empty and needy and believe there is never enough of anything, possessions, love, attention. They talk a lot, trying to get attention from others, often addictive and exhausting to be around. There is a weakness in the sense of independency, a tendency to cling to others, a decreased aggressiveness, and an inner feeling of needing to be held, supported, or taken care of. There's a deep feeling of emptiness. The oral person lives life in a very small manner. Disappointment is expected, and hope of fulfillment is suppressed. Aggression and assertiveness is weak. Orals sometimes have a difficulty holding a job. The physical characteristics of the oral: the body is often long and thin with loose, undeveloped muscles. Remember, the body is formed because at some point in the development of these characterologies, the energy that was flowing freely to all parts of the body as one grows begins to be trapped in various parts of the body. And so other parts of the body don't get the same amount of energy in terms of its development. There can be general slumping owing to the weakness of the musculature. Breathing is often shallow, eyes are weak. The typical look is appealing with what we call puppy dog eyes, an appeal for love and support. Shoulders are pulled back, compensated by forward thrust of the head. So there's a forward thrust of the head, the body slumps into itself, the sternum is compressed, the buttocks is tucked under. Forward movement is initiated from the head. So the oral leads with the head, a forward head. The chest is often deflated. There may be weakness in the leg. Often orals look younger than their age. Sometimes orals talk excessively. There is always one more story with more details. Questions about either of these so far? See what happens if you just take one characteristic, sitting down, which is pushing the head forward from the shoulders, and see how that feels to you. See what happens to you if you push the head forward and it's not centered over your body, it's forward, and you always lean into the head. It changes how you feel about yourself and how you behave. Now, I want to give you one example before we go on, about how this work not only begins to help the guys in PPGG become very expressive with characters, because they're embodying all these characterologies, and we do improvisations by putting one characterology with another characterology. And we switch up all the time. And sometimes when we begin to get into text work, some of them say, oh, I see there's an oral element here that I can use, or there's a schizoid element I can use. But not only does this practice let them explore how trauma has affected their own bodies by having them explore all of the bodies and all of the characterologies, it also has proven, surprisingly, not maybe surprisingly to us, to help them live where they live. And I'll give you an example. One of our members came in one evening and said that characterology had helped him diffuse a situation with a corrections officer. One of the things about characterology, and one of the things about why it helps so much with trauma, is that other people's responses to you through characterology is not your fault. It frees you from believing that when people behave towards you in a certain way, that would get your defenses engaged. It frees you to think about the fact, oh, that's their defenses. It has nothing to do with me. So this gentleman came in. He's a large teddy bear of a guy. And a CO had asked him to get on the wall for no reason at all, which means turn your back to the CO and put your hands up so you can be frisked. And in a normal situation, he might have said to the CO, why are you challenging me? What are you doing this for? Which could have escalated the confrontation. Instead, what he did was enact an oral. He defaulted his posture and his thinking to the oral. Oh, officer, I'm so sorry. What did I do? I don't know. Can you explain to me? And because he defaulted to the oral, the officer did not know how to respond because he was looking for the fight response. That's what the officer wanted, was the fight response. But when this gentleman deferred to the oral, the officer let him go because he couldn't push his buttons the way he wanted to, out of his own defensive systems, out of his own characterology. And so there are several examples that the men have told us over the years about how characterology and the notion, the knowledge that someone else behaving toward you has nothing to do with you most of the time, it's out of their own defenses, and that you're not responsible for it, means that you do not have to be reactive. You do not have to engage the way you might engage. The next characterology Lowen named the masochist, the suppressed child, or the consolidator. And again, you can see the drawing on the screen. This is a shorter, almost a bodybuilder kind of body. It's thicker. The upper body sometimes and the lower body are not quite matched. The upper body sometimes a little bit bigger. The masochist or suppressed or consolidator. The masochistic character's trauma resulted from being overly dominated by a parent or caregiver when their autonomy was just beginning to bloom. Again, these characterologies may not have formed if another caregiver had countered the behavior of the dominant caregiver, or that the child had someone who loved them unconditionally. The parents, viewing the child as merely an extension of themselves, controlled the child to an extreme, allowing the child no personal space. The masochist responds by holding everything inside, their feelings, creativity, and self-expression, all the while boiling with anger from continuously dishonoring their own will. So they're taught not to honor what they need, which creates a lot of boiling anger and frustration within the masochist. They don't know how to become free. The masochist may be submissive on the outside, but inside has strong feelings of spite, negativity, hostility, and even superiority. They blame others for their lack of autonomy, yet stay trapped in dependence. Sometimes the masochist creates negative situations as the only way to justify getting angry and relieve some of the built-up anger inside. So that corrections officer who decided to, for no reason, interact with the member that I described just a moment ago may have been a masochist, may have had some feelings about their own autonomy and was trying to exercise or provoke anger from the person he stopped so that he could release his own anger. The only pleasures that don't cause anxiety are saying no, resisting, complaining, blaming, getting even, and feeling guilty. The physical characteristics of the suppressed or the consolidator. There's a round, childlike face, a sweet, openly innocent expression as a way to hide the anger inside. There's a short, thick, muscular body, a short, thick neck. The waist is also shorter and thicker. The posture resembles that of a dog with the tail tucked between the legs. A typical look is one of suggesting or pain. This can be masked by an expression of confusion. Gestures tend to protect rather than open. So, for example, if I want to make a gesture and invite you in, I might spread my arms like this. The masochist might say, go like this, so that they're protecting, they're not opening. So as the men work through these characterologies and begin to create characters, they come up with a repertoire of physicalizations that they can use as characters themselves. It also begins to allow them to free themselves from whatever characterologies and the trauma in the body that they carry with them. The fourth character is the rigid, the rejected child or the achiever. And again, this is a very tall, usually a tall, well-proportioned, the look is someone who's very together and very equally proportioned. The rigid's main issue is the denial of the authentic self. The structure is caused by rejection from a parent or caregiver during the phases of childhood when the heart chakra is developing. In other words, just as the person is beginning to really open up and love people around them and understand the meaning of love and the feeling of love, someone important to them rejects them. This trauma can occur through an abrupt shift in either parents' or caregivers' attitude towards the child. Once loving and supportive, a parent suddenly demands that the child puts their needs and feelings aside and acts more grown up. Sometimes this happens with a child of divorce, when one parent tries to use the child against the other parent in terms of the divorce proceedings or the conflicts within the separation of the couple. The child feels that they are not good enough as they are and begins to hold back all feelings, trying to look perfect, to rise above their need for love. Rigids often focus on outer world achievement. However, their heart is closed and broken, and they find it hard to trust others out of the fear of rejection, so they stay in their head. Life can seem routine as there is no connection to feeling. Sex and love are two different things. Rigids seem to have it all. To us, to the outsider, they seem to have it all. They usually manifest easily, and they are quite successful. They seem good looking, and everyone notices them. They appear to find life easy. The appearance is good and proportional. The body looks and feels integrated and connected. The head is held high with straight spine. The eyes are generally bright. Unlike the masochist, the rigid compensates with a strong and aggressive attitude that brightens both his, her, their manner, and eyes. While they are comfortable in the world, they are not comfortable in their own emotions. So let me stop for a moment and ask, are there any public figures that you can think of that manifest some of the characteristics of the rigid? Any idea? Yeah, Ava. Robin, I'm sorry, Robin.
I mean, I guess like a lot of like athletes or actors.
Yes, there's some of that. Absolutely. There's some of that in athletes and actors. The one that I always point to is Mitt Romney.
Yeah, like political figures.
Yes, and he never answers a question, and he never seems to really state what he feels. The rigid, a politician who's rigid, if you ask them a question, they'll say, "That's an interesting question. What are your thoughts on it?" They won't commit to a substantial response because they're afraid of their own sense of how things are. We'll go back to the final characterology is the psychopath. Again, this is Lowen's term. Others have called it the seduced child or the inspirer. And again, the drawing tends to give you the physical characteristics. The upper body tends to be a little bit larger than the lower body, and the head is raised and sort of tilted forward as if the person's always looking down at you if they're taller than you. And there are two categories for the psychopath, the bullying and the seducing. The trauma resulting in this character structure occurs when one parent seduces the child, not sexually necessarily, for their own narcissistic need, trying to tie the child more closely to them. The psychopathic character has a huge investment in the ideal image of themselves, where they are never wrong and always in control. Their feelings of betrayal undercut their natural leadership. They are very charismatic and inspiring to be around. They sometimes have huge hearts, and they're easy communicators. There's a drive for power and the need to dominate and control. They know that their cause is right, know they are right, and know that they are good, which is why they are so good at winning. Deep inside, they don't trust anyone. Everyone is ultimately their enemy, even their closest associates. They see life as a battleground. If someone is right, meaning themselves, then someone else is wrong. They want their own way all the time and can abuse power. They fear betrayal from others. They can come off superior or aloof, yet they are inferior underneath. And the physical characteristics, the body of the bullying type has a disproportionate development in the upper half of the body. It gives the impression of being blown up, sort of a barrel chest, puffed up. The seducing type is more regular and does not have a blown up look. The look of the seducing psychopath is closer to that of the rigid. There are marked tensions in the eyes and the occipital region. There is energy in the head pulled upward. There is energy in the shoulders. They view the world as attacking them. They throw their energy to the back of their body, then up the back and over the head at the supposed aggressor. So they're always tilting the head down as the energy comes over the head and back to the person that they are confronting. Anybody have a thought about the bullying psychopath? Any public figures come to mind? Well, Donald Trump is the perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the perfect example of the bullying psychopath. He's very charismatic. He's quick on his feet. He, as we all know, he throws people under the bus if he feels they betrayed him. He for some of us at least, abuses his power. And when you know Lowen, you can see the behavior. It's quite extraordinary. Anybody think of a seducing psychopath, a public version of a seducing psychopath? Another president has the characteristics of a seducing psychopath.
Clinton?
Yeah, Bill Clinton.
And Obama?
Obama's a little, well, remember, nobody's pure. So Obama's also a bit of a rigid.
Yeah.
Because remember, he held.
Yeah, I guess it's more on the rigid.
Yeah, he was criticized for not really ever speaking his mind or being aggressive enough with his policies. Part of that came out of his fear of being the angry black man, I think, as some people have analyzed it. But some of it is also the fact that there may be a lack of trust in his own ideas and himself at times. Anybody think of a masochist, another political figure who, the round face, baby face, a little bit of a short barrel-like body, a little bit short neck.
Newt Gingrich?
Newt is possible. Like
that's what you're describing physically.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. But think about the seething underneath. Think of someone who has the sweet kind of nice face on the outside, but seems to seethe underneath. And sometimes it breaks through to bait people or by mistake. I think Hillary Clinton has some masochistic qualities in terms of, remember when she went to Kentucky and said, we're just going to close all the mines. It's when someone provokes that anger, it's sometimes inadvertent, but that statement caused a lot of anger in other people, which she wasn't, I don't think, was prepared for. Let's go back. Now, Lowen creates star bodies. And in the center and the top is how a natural energy flows. Notice that all the lines on the outside are single, and the arrows on the outside from the core flow outward. There are no blocks. There are no lines within the star body. And the top of that star is the head and the ego. The bottom of the star is the genital and physical. You've got 2 feet. The social is on the right, the creative or productive's on the right screen, social on the left, and the 2 hands and head ego. If you look to the left of that, you see the oral, you see the dotted line, so that there's weakness in the lower body. There's a kind of a core energy flowing in dotted lines out to the external parts of the body. And so the energy is broken up as it flows, and so it doesn't reach with any strength the outside of the body. If you look to the right of that center, you see the rigid. There are no lines blocking, but there's a double line on the outside. So the energy flows almost completely to the outside of the body, but the rigid has built a barrier between the outside of the body, where the energy should flow, and where the rigid can be totally natural and who they should be or who they are. But because of that double line, the energy doesn't quite get there. Then below that's the masochist. And this is a very complicated one, because there is the energy flowing out from the core, but then there's a central block. Then there's a dotted line where the body begins to break apart in the masochist, and then the energy flows out strongly when they explode. So the larger circle inside is where they hold the energy most of the time. But when they explode, it explodes to the outside, and then it's pulled back in within that larger circle inside. And there's the psychopath, which is the most unusual of all. Notice that there's a weak flow to the bottom lower half. All the energy is going to the top half, and the body is distorted, more distorted than the other characteristics in terms of the flow of energy. And finally, the schizoid, where there's a double line, where the energy never gets to the outside of the periphery of the body, where the body doesn't flow and move easily, and the emotion and the trauma is trapped inside that double line, inside the larger body. So these are final thoughts from Bessel van der Kolk. As long as you keep secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know. That takes an enormous amount of courage. As I often tell my students, the 2 most important phrases in therapy, as in yoga, are notice that and what happens next. Once you start approaching your body with curiosity rather than with fear, everything shifts. In order to change people, people need to become aware of their sensations and the way that their bodies interact with the world around them. Physical self-awareness is the first step in releasing the tyranny of the past. Traumatized people are terrified to feel deeply. This is a repeat of the phrase from earlier. They're afraid to experience their emotions because emotions lead to loss of control. In contrast, theater is about embodying emotions, giving voice to them, becoming rhythmically engaged, and taking on trauma in different roles. So the reason, again, to employ characterology in a trauma-infused setting, particularly in a carceral setting, is that, as Clifton said in his opening note, it allows some distance between the emotional effect of the trauma and rehearsing the trauma, so that by embodying various kinds of characters or characterology, the men begin to explore how trauma is held in the body, and they can use that for themselves. And it begins to also give them a different vocabulary. If their body or their trauma is mostly from childhood and then reinforced and reinforced and reinforced, and I think that, as Michael says in his statement at the opening, that all youth crime, he believes, comes from some kind of trauma. There's also the trauma of the carceral state. And there's also the trauma that is often overlooked in a carceral setting, and that is the trauma created in the individual who did the harm, who created harm. We've seen over and over again some of the members of PPTG at times when they're working on their own pieces, or when they come in some evenings, as Jamie suggested, and need to share something in the space, how they are holding the trauma of what they did emotionally and physically in their bodies. So the three great traumas are from childhood and growing up, from being incarcerated, which is a hugely traumatic setting, and the results of being incarcerated are traumatic, but also whatever they did, whatever harm they created, was also a traumatic event for them. And by using something like characterology that allows them a space between their trauma and exploring trauma in general terms, they begin to let go. They begin to physicalize in a different way, which creates, through the Viola Spolin, who I did my dissertation on, who wrote the book Improvisation for the Theater, said, through the physical, we reach the spiritual. And so by rehearsing these characterologies, they're able to find different body vocabularies, which begins to free whatever the limited vocabulary is that's constraining them, without having to delve deeply into what we might call the psychological process of the trauma, which we're not qualified to do, and which we don't want to leave them with, because there's no place to get help. And sometimes they'll come in after a characterology session or some of the other sessions, and they'll begin to talk about what it evoked for them. But because it was evoked physically and through the methodologies of theater, it's spoken about in a way that releases them from the emotional content in a way. I remember when I was first invited to come up with Steve to look at PPTG. The second night I was there, the men asked me what I was going to do for them. I mean, they have ultimate decision-making power on whether or not we continue with them. If they ask one of us to leave, that would be it. We would have to leave, because they have agency over the group. And I talked about devised theater. I talked about using autobiography as a jumping off point for pieces. And I asked them the next week to bring in what they thought were the 10 most important events in their lives at the time. Just a little bullet point, 2 or 3 words or a sentence. And so the next week, they brought in these bullet points, and I asked one person to volunteer to read their list. And one person did. And on that list was the phrase, "Big Bear eats." And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Tell me the story. And it turned out to be the story about the first time this person, at the age of 9, had been sexually molested. How was I to know, right? Big Bear eats. But I provoked the traumatic event. And as he was telling the story of his neighbor who had a cabin upstate from where he and his mother and sister lived, he invited both the sister and this gentleman, and his own kids, and the neighbors on the other side had one child, up to his cabin to spend the weekend. And they all went. And during that weekend, this individual crawled into bed at one time or another with all those children and abused every one of them. And as he was telling this story, he was sobbing. I realized by asking him about this, which I had no reason to know, but I have to be responsible because I asked. And one of the things that he felt terribly traumatized about is that he couldn't protect his sister. Not only could he not protect himself, but his sister. And so, of course, there's a lot of feeling in the room. And so this person was sort of the archivist for the group. And he had one of those paper portfolio things that stretches, right? And he had hundreds of pages of paper in there. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I had an instinct about it. And I asked him if it was all right if I poured all those papers out on the table in front of him. And he said, sure. And I noticed as I poured the papers out, there was a copy of the Prisoner Express. Now, some of you may know the Prisoner Express. It's published out of the Druryland Library at Cornell. A lot of people who are incarcerated around the country subscribe to it. It publishes essays, artwork, etc. So I asked him to turn his back to the table. And everybody else in the room saw what I was doing. I took the Prisoner Express and I had a sweater on. It was winter. And I put it behind my back under the sweater. And then I pretended to shuffle. I shuffled all the papers on the table and I turned around and I had him turn around and I said, can you tell me the story again? But while you do, I want you to find the Prisoner Express in this pile of papers. I want you to please look for the Prisoner Express. And when you find it, we'll stop telling the story. Well, he couldn't find it because I had it. But what happened was he was no longer crying. He was no longer in the trauma state he was in because he had another objective. He had another intention. In the theater, I use the word intention instead of objective because it pushes you into the future rather than pushes you from the past. He had another intention, and the intention was to tell the story while he had that intention of looking for the Prisoner Express. And the story became not only much less traumatic for him, it became much more interesting and comfortable, I might say, in a way to listen to, because he was not suffering through it this time. And I realized on the way home that what happened was the trauma had been theatricalized in a way. It became a secondary purpose to looking for the Prisoner Express. And it freed him in a way from the original emotional content of the story so he could tell it in a way and that freed him from the emotional content of it. And I think that that's the power of using theater techniques and it's not always that direct, obviously, but using theater techniques and having a theater group that uses, as Clifton again said, creating that safe space between their trauma and what they need to explore about that trauma. It creates the distance rather than immersing them completely in the trauma. The trauma is still there, and sometimes they need to talk about it, and sometimes the stories that come out that we perform, but again, the object becomes the performance, not the explanation of the trauma. When they write a piece and we look at it and we talk about it and we make suggestions and they bring it back and they work at it again, whatever trauma might be embedded in the story becomes secondary to the performance of the story because we're going to perform for an audience. And they have to come up with the skills, the technique, the craft to perform that story. And it's interesting to see how that journey, and Michael and Clifton somehow intuitively knew this, somehow that journey frees them from the experience and allows them then to become, as the motto says, to know and grow into ourselves. Questions? Questions?
I don't have a question, but as somebody
Please.
who experienced the characterology, I mean, I think something that you don't get from this particular
Yes, exactly.
Zoom thing is there's a lot of like levity and fun in it. I mean, it's very much about like, okay, so this is seducing psychopath. What are the characteristics? And we would walk around the room and start to embody those characteristics, and people are laughing. And, you know, like it becomes very much a characterization. And I think that levity and that also distance, it's not about like, are you a seducing psychopath? It's
Right.
just let's embody this and then see how it feels, enjoy being with each other in that way, and then having this way of like, you know, slowly, if you choose to become more self-aware of what your own characterology might be, you can, but that's never the goal or what is facilitated. It's more about, again, just embodying and having fun with it, and then having a shared language that you can call upon, especially when they do get into rehearsing the pieces. Like, okay, well, this character is a rigid, so show me that. And then instead of trying to also teach a bunch of different acting techniques, which can be difficult too.
Thank you for that, Jamie. Yes, that's a very important point, that this creates a great deal of humor in the room, particularly when they face each other playing, one's playing a bullying psychopath and the other's playing an oral, and they crack each other up. It's terrific fun. And the energy in the room is fabulous when they're doing this stuff, because it's not only teaching them something about acting, it's not only teaching them something about or letting them explore trauma in a very safe and sort of distant way, but it's also freeing them from the rigidity of their lives in prison. Because in that room, they get to behave in ways that they can never behave in the confines of the facility. And so that freedom creates energy. Remember, Sean talked about the energy in the room and how it can build in a positive way. That's what happens most of the time when we're doing characterology, that the energy in the room builds. Sometimes it gets very serious because sometimes there's an improv between two people in two different characterologies. It has nothing to do with the two individuals, but it becomes a serious moment. And then there's that moment where they go, oh my gosh, that was really powerful. I see the power of theater. I see the power of character portrayal. And it's always sort of referred back to in that frame of reference. Jamie's right. When we do this for a couple of weeks, there's so much humor and so much joy and so much sharing. And it's also a way of increasing the collaboration and trust amongst the group as well. Because everybody, even the facilitators, are participating. We're all walking around like masochists or schizoids or orals and playing with the guys. And so it creates a sense of trust amongst everybody, facilitators, members, et cetera. And that's why we call ourselves facilitators. We're not leaders or teachers, because we're facilitating what we hope are their goals, what they have told us are their goals. Other questions? Thanks for that, Jamie. Wendy, you look pensive. Yeah, Jamie. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. No, it's very hard to go over this in this setting. If we were in a room together, this would be a lot of fun. And you would experience a lot of interesting responses to your own exploration of these characterologies. But because we were doing somatic practices today, Sean and I talked about what we were each going to do and thought that characterology would be an interesting follow-up, because it's just a taste of a technique that works with the body and creating it a safe space, and a safe space between the individuals exploring it and what they might be carrying with them, so that we're not exploding that in the room. like I did that first night with the gentleman who I had to figure out how to, and I just lucked out in coming up with something that worked to reverse what had happened at that time. Final thoughts. Final questions. Well, thank you all for attending today. I think Isaac will send out the materials. There are, each one of these characterologies comes with 2 or 3 or 4 pages of description and thoughts. So they're much more complex than we're able to cover here. Yes, Isaac says that he'll send out the materials that we have in our folder for this workshop. Thank you all. And it's good to see some old friends here. And I hope that this was useful to you today, and look for further workshops or further events that are sponsored by the Arts, Justice, and Safety Coalition. Thanks very much. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
And Isaac.
Thanks, Bruce and Isaac.
Thank you. Thanks, Aaron. Thank you. Thanks. Bye, Ava.